Hello and welcome to The Cusp. I'm Doy Santos, your host. On this episode, we're going to be continuing with a series called Can Duterte Avoid the Pitfalls of Marcos? In episode 1, we discussed President Marcos's complete lack of accountability and compared President Duterte to his situation and concluded by saying that despite the similarities that exist between Duterte and Marcos in terms of their authoritative style of leadership, that as of this date, President Duterte hasn't really succumbed, hasn't really attained absolute power, and it still remains accountable to the people through institutional mechanisms that are still in place, which have been performing their duties under the Constitution. And so this leads us now to the second pitfall of Marcos, which is greed. And we'll be examining and comparing the two presidents and seeing whether President Duterte risks falling into the same pitfall of Marcos. Now, I'll start off this by answering this by saying that Ferdinand Marcos, at his peak, was a brilliant political strategist and tactician. He knew how to bend geopolitical powers to suit his own agenda, and he knew how to extract maximum military aid, for instance, from the United States, by sowing anxiety in Washington that the scourge of communism could take over the country, that we would be the next domino to fall in the Cold War. He was also a master at using technocrats in order to deodorize his regime to become the favorite child of the IMF and World Bank, in order to acquire soft loans. He then, once he had gained access to Uncle Sam's pocketbook, he then turned around and committed the cardinal mistake of using funds to enrich himself and his family. Now, of course, the Marcoses don't deny this. They, through a spokesman, have offered the government to return a portion of the money that they say they took for safekeeping. Now, while they are making this offer without any admission of guilt in a kind of out-of-court settlement, think about this for a second. Why would you even offer to turn over billions to the government if you hadn't stolen it? Right? That's the question. So the Supreme Court has estimated in the past that the Marcoses stole somewhere in the region of 10 billion US dollars from the Philippine government during their entire period in office, of which a mere 3.7 billion US dollars has been retrieved by the government. So if you believe that they just took the money for safekeeping, as they claim, because their father, because they were expecting their father to return to power very shortly, then why aren't they willing to return all of it? That's the question. So that's the situation. Back to Duterte now. Senator Trillanes has alleged that Duterte holds billions of pesos in several bank accounts, which would be unexplained by his income as a public servant and be inconsistent with his statement of assets and liabilities. Senator Trillanes produced a report supposedly produced by the Anti-Money Laundering Council to back his claim. This report, the AMLAC, which was supposedly the source of his allegations, denies that it came from them, however. And so what are we to make of all this? There are allegations, of course, that his son-in-law are involved in some kind of illicit activity. But again, as of today, there isn't any substantial evidence that has been put forward to back up this claim. Senator Trillanes has said, well, why don't you execute a waiver so that we can uncover these bank accounts that are in this report, the source of which seems to be dubious at this point, or questionable. Just execute a waiver and prove that you don't own them. Well, and then the president has said, why am I going to do that, stupid? And then people have taken that to mean that, hey, he's got something to hide. Why are you defensive? Why are you, if you've got nothing to hide, sign a waiver. Well, then President Duterte has actually signed a waiver. It's embodied in his statement of assets and liabilities and net worth. A public official signs a waiver that says that the ombudsman or any authorized representative of the ombudsman can can get from any government agency to investigate whether their statements of assets and liabilities are true or not. So this covers the bank secrecy law. All public officials execute this waiver, meaning to say, well, if there's no need for President Duterte to sign the waiver, because there's this blanket waiver already that you do when you file your SAL-N. And if he signs a specific waiver for those bank accounts, then it's kind of like dignifying the accusation, right? That treating it as a special case, when in fact it doesn't need to be treated as a special case. But anyway, the Chief Justice Sereno has in fact said that there is a waiver already in place. There's no need to sign a waiver, right? But the president has offered, if you can prove that these allegations are true, he'd be willing to resign. He would gladly have his son prosecuted or any of his relatives prosecuted if it's proven that they are in fact engaged in some illegal activity. But as far as President Duterte's lifestyle is concerned, he doesn't seem to exhibit a taste for the finer things in life. That much we can say, right? He still inhabits the same simple middle-class dwelling in Davao that he has been living in over the years. There are no, Boracay mansions or, as in the case of Erap. Instead of throwing lavish parties in Malacanang for foreign dignitaries, the president chose to bring Prime Minister Shinzo Abe down to Davao and have a simple meal with him. Right? So, in his official capacity, he said he's averse to using the trappings of power, the presidential plane or the yacht, for his own personal trips. He's using it to ferry some of the wounded soldiers in combat. As far as greed is concerned, probably President Duterte does not seem to have succumbed to it, or at least there's no evidence that he has. Although there are these long-standing allegations, no definitive proof has yet been offered. Of course, he might be very good at hiding, if he has ill-gotten wealth, he might just be very good at hiding it, keeping a low profile, pretending to lead a humble life. But until substantive proof can surface to that effect, then we can probably say that at this point he hasn't fallen into the pitfall of greed. So now we come to the third pitfall, which is the last one that we'll be discussing in this episode, which is the pitfall of arrogance. Arrogance, or hubris, as the Greeks called it. Hubris. Hubris is a funny thing. The ultimate kind of hubris is the belief in one's own invincibility, of course. That one can hold on to the top spot indefinitely. Right? And this follows after you've gotten absolute power, you've amassed wealth. The next thing you're going to think is, well, when is this going to end? And hubris will tell you, no, this is never going to end. I'm going to stay here forever. Right? So that's the pitfall of hubris, which follows on from the two previous ones. So now, while President Marcos he had absolute grip on power, This actually enabled him to take a very long-term view in policy and planning, which was a good thing, actually. However, the belief that he could hold on indefinitely and stay on indefinitely, or his family could stay on indefinitely, was the source of his ultimate downfall. Tim Kelsall, a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, has looked at a number of authoritarian regimes in Southeast Asia and in Africa, and has concluded that the ability to plan and manage succession effectively by a regime is what separates successful ones from unsuccessful ones. Kelsall summarizes his findings in one paper by saying the following, and I quote, "Sub-Saharan Africa has had more high-growth regimes than Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asia is by far the richer region. One of the reasons is that high-growth regimes in Sub-Saharan Africa have been less durable than in Southeast Asia. And a key cause of this is that, unlike Southeast Asian regimes, they have rarely survived transitions in political leadership. This singularity has contributed to some Southeast Asian countries experiencing a pattern of almost continuous high economic growth over the past 40 years, while in Sub-Saharan Africa, growth, even where it has been high, has not been sustained." End of quote. So let me just recap and summarize what Kelsall is saying here. He's saying that the ability to manage political transition and the willingness to hand over power, not overstaying in office, in other words, is a crucial factor in countries sustaining high growth over a long period of time. In political economic studies, there is a key finding that democratic regimes tend to experience lower rates of growth on average compared to authoritarian regimes. However, authoritarian regimes experience a very high variability of growth. What does that mean? In the case of the Marcos regime, the Philippines achieved some of the highest rates of growth in the 1970s under martial law. But the problem is that when his regime came to an end, it went down in flames and, engulfed the country in chaos. That chaos led to some of the worst growth rates the Philippines has ever experienced in its history. So from the highs, extreme highs to the extreme lows, that's the variability. All right. So on average, perhaps it's, higher than normal, but, you go from the high to the crash, the highs to the valleys. And what Kelsall is saying is that happened because of his inability to manage succession in an orderly fashion. The reason things ended up so chaotic post-Marcos was that he failed to groom a successor or manage a transition within his regime. No one within his government seemed capable of taking over, Marcos claimed. Of course, that's what we call hubris, right? No, I'm irreplaceable. No one can replace me. The only person, Marcos said, who could, probably be up to the task of replacing him was his arch nemesis and political rival, Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. Now, when he returned from exile in 1983, Senator Aquino believed he could convince Marcos to agree to a power-sharing deal with the opposition. However, Marcos at the time was already experiencing a decline in his health. He wasn't in the pink of health. He was suffering from a lingering disease, and so was coming from a position of weakness. Aquino saw that and wanted to head off an internal coup by the people around Marcos. He wanted to head off because as the leader started to grow frail and weak, he knew that somebody from within his inner circle would probably topple the leader. And then that would plunge the country into an abyss of chaos, right? So Senator Aquino came home hoping to effect this power sharing deal with the leader, probably with conditions, of some amnesty here, share power with the opposition. And the 1984 Batasan elections would usher that in, so the opposition would be elected, the administration would have its, and then they would have a power sharing deal, and then so there would be a transition into there would be a democratic transition where there's a ruling party, there's an opposition, and there would be a power sharing deal, and then followed by a smooth handover of power. That was the formula for reconciliation that Senator Aquino was offering. Now, since Marcos was in poor health at the time, he probably wasn't fully in charge of the military. One theory behind Ninoy's assassination was that somebody from within his inner circle probably felt threatened and then decided to, order his assassination. This is what triggered the events of 83 to 86. The Philippines entered into a deep recession during this time, as the death of Senator Aquino prompted street protests, boycotts, and all sorts of civil disobedience. It didn't help that one of Marcos's cronies fled the country prior to all this, taking millions of dollars with him, which prompted a mini bank crisis. The coups and military adventurism that took place under the presidency of Corazon Aquino, Ninoy's widow, sapped investor confidence and confined us to years of stagnation. The discontinuation of many well-designed projects and programs associated with Marcos, such as his Population Commission, the Metro Transport Authority, and long-term energy contracts, weakened the state's ability to manage key functions of economic development. Now, this all stemmed from Marcos's inability to contemplate his own demise and prepare for it, which was a result of his, you guessed it, his hubris, right? So the question is, can President Duterte avoid this pitfall? Well, if his words are anything to go by, Digong doesn't seem to have any interest to hold on to power. He often speaks about resigning or handing over power prematurely. Once his plan of fulfilling his promise to shift to a federal, semi-presidential / semi-parliamentary system are accomplished, Duterte has said that he is willing to step aside even before his term ends to make way for a successor. Let's remember that when he was elected into office, Digong was 71 years of age. The man is old. He has health issues, and he doesn't seem to want to stay longer than he has to. And so, what can we say? When it comes to his own mortality, both physically and politically, Duterte doesn't seem to have a problem with it. When it comes to hubris, Duterte seems to not be guilty of it, in other words. So, let's not also forget that when President Duterte was a congressman in the early 2000s, he actually resigned from office in the middle of his first term. So what this demonstrates is the fact that he's unlike any politician that there is at the moment. He has no problems letting go of his office if he feels that he's got nothing to contribute. It's not talked about how when he as a congressman he felt like he wasn't contributing to the discussions in Congress, and he wasn't well suited to that job. So he resolved that he would just pack up his bags and go back to Davao, and resign his office. So in that regard, the proposition has already been tested. He's not the kind who will cling on to power when his due date is up. He's willing to let go. So that brings us to the close of this episode, part 2 of the series, Can Duterte Avoid the Pitfalls of Marcos? Do drop us a line, follow the links that are appearing now, and use the social media handles there to send us your feedback and your comments and even your suggestions. I'm quite happy to take them all on board. Thank you. It's been a pleasure hosting this episode of The Cusp. I'm Doy Santos. See you again on the next edition of The Cusp.